recognized. Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would be pretty reckless to leave the United States, the only advanced nation, without an export-import bank, and I don't think the entire majority is with this subcommittee on that score. But the determination to shut down the bank, I suppose, is exemplified by the fact that we're into the fourth hearing aimed to do precisely that, even though the IG has previously reported that there's no evidence of widespread employee misconduct or systemic involvement in the bank in fraud. So I'm not sure what more the IG has to tell us. But I do want to ask about the only thing I could think of to ask about that would assure members who had anything approaching an open mind on this issue would be to ask about internal controls as they exist now. So I'm interested in your findings on internal controls, assuming that the bank can be reauthorized. We won't be left an orphan in the advanced world. Let me ask you if there are any aspects of the bank's internal controls where you still believe improvement is needed, and what those areas might be.
We've made several recommendations as far as internal controls go, starting from some of our original work back in 2009, 2010, looking at the medium-term program, and we did find deficiencies at that time. A lot of those deficiencies had been corrected. What we've reported back to the committee on the outstanding recommendations that we believe are most important, and which I touched on in my opening statement, is that we believe that the senior management and the board of directors of the bank should play more of a role in the overall enterprise risk management. So with the board of directors—
As opposed to who plays that role now?
Well, right now it's really just a function of the employees of the bank, and the board of directors, who are the presidential appointees, Senate confirmed, 5 people who are supposed to be in charge of the bank. Their role is really to serve as more of a credit committee and approve individual transactions. We believe if they had more of a role in looking at enterprise risk, that would be a better governance structure for the bank.
Have they agreed to do so?
No, they have not agreed. That's one of our unresolved recommendations. Some of the legislation does contemplate that.
Does that need to be, do they believe that needs to be in legislation? And it's often, there's often a line on who can do what in such an enterprise.
Right. I think that there's a difference in terms of policy and in terms of how it's accomplished.
Have you seen the bill? You say it is in the bill.
Yes, I believe it's in all of the reform proposals.
Overall, have you seen improvements in the bank's internal controls when they have been brought to their attention by the IG?
Yes, we have seen improvements. There were problems that we've identified in the past years. They've improved many of them, put a lot more internal controls in place, updated their policy manual to put things in writing and have clear policies that employees can follow. So we've seen significant improvement in that area. We do have outstanding recommendations that we believe that there are further improvements that would help reduce risk at the bank.
And you've testified it takes time to, of course, implement those recommendations.
With recommendations, it'll generally take some period of time to fully implement them.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your testimony, Mr. McCarthy.
I thank the gentlelady. Would the gentleman from Georgia prepared to ask questions, or does he want the chair to go? You comfortable, Mr. Heiss? You ready to go?
Thank you.
You ready to go?
I can be.
I'll yield to the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. McCarthy. I appreciate it, your willingness to come back. And a couple of questions that come to my mind on the green type things. Are you aware that when Ex-Im made a $32+ million loan to LM Wind Power, that company, at the time the loan was made, was about to make some huge layoffs here in the United States?
I'm not familiar with that particular transaction. We did look at a wind project that had similar issues, where there was a wind project in India, and the exporter of the, or excuse me, it wasn't wind, it was solar, but in the green energy space, that there were issues with the exporter going bankrupt at the time that it was shipping the products overseas that were being supported by XM.
Right, I'm familiar with that one too, but there, there's cases like this particular one, LM Wind Power had branches in both Arkansas and North Dakota, if I'm correct, and they laid off hundreds after a loan was made, $32 million. And is that a normal practice? Does XM check in to those type of things before making a loan? Do you inspect a company and they're, as you mentioned, if they're on the verge of bankruptcy or if they're on the verge of making decisions that's going to impact U.S. jobs? Do y'all check into that?
Well, that's an issue that we encountered in the solar project in India that we looked at and did an inspection on. The bank makes a loan to the foreign company that's purchasing the equipment from the U.S. company, and so as part of the due diligence process, they're doing due diligence and looking at the credit profile of the company that's buying, and recommended that the bank expand its due diligence into the U.S. exporter and their financial state. And
okay, I'm not talking about financial state. I'm talking about U.S. jobs. I mean, that's part of the goal of the bank as well, to secure U.S. jobs. When something like that happens, are there any consequences for companies that you give huge loans to and then they lay off U.S. workers? Are there any consequences, or are loans ever revoked or anything along those lines?
Well, because the loans are generally to the foreign purchasers of those products, I don't believe that they would be reversed because of problems at the U.S. company.
Okay, well, there was a similar one in Canada, Project First Solar, $455 million loaned to them. That particular company ended up with their solar panels or whatever, they bought them from themselves. Are you familiar with that scenario?
I don't believe I'm familiar with that particular case.
Okay, well, they received XM financing to export to themselves, $455 million. You're not familiar with that?
Not with that transaction.
Does that type of thing happen very often? Are you aware of companies that take loans from XM and then just use it themselves rather than for what it was intended to be used?
Well, I think the issue is that the loans have to have U.S. products going overseas. If they're related party transactions, if they're a U.S. company and a foreign subsidiary, there may be related party transactions, but the goods still have to leave the United States to be qualified for export support.
All right, well, you mentioned the one in India. That's a similar type deal. XM awarded that particular loan some $400 million, and their credit rating was not very good. Was that just a fluke, or I mean, you were referring to that a little bit a while ago?
Right. Well, we identified with that particular project, we did review that transaction. The transaction at this time is performing and is in repayment. The main issue that we identified is that because the U.S. exporter had gone bankrupt, that there were issues that the warranty of the solar panels that were shipped was no longer valid, and so it could create potential problems in the future if that project isn't able to generate enough energy to repay the loans that have been given to the project. It puts XM in a vulnerable position.
Do you know how many jobs were lost when they went bankrupt?
I do not.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCarthy, about a year ago, former XM employee Johnny Gutierrez sat at that table and took the Fifth Amendment when we were attempting to question him about some of his activities at the XM Bank. About 6 weeks ago, you sat right where you're sitting today and told us that Mr. Gutierrez had been indicted by the Justice Department just 2 days before that particular hearing, and then about a week later, Mr. Gutierrez pled guilty to bribery and fraud charges. You also indicated that day that there may be more indictments coming in the Gutierrez case, and you said there are 31 open fraud investigations, and there may be indictments in some of those. Has any of that changed? Is that still the number, 31, or is it a bigger number today, or is it a smaller number? Have there been more indictments? Where are we at?
I think our current number, I think, is 29 open investigations.
29.
Right,
Okay.
as of today.
What about the indictment issue?
The indictments, I believe that we have had some new cases that we've reported, and it's still the same. When we have cases that we investigate, the fact that we're investigating that matter means that there is a possibility.
When you
that
say new
charges
cases
will
you've
be brought
reported,
from that.
does that mean there are new referrals? Other 31, other 29?
I would need to check as the timing as to when I last testified. I believe we've had other indictments, guilty pleas that I've reported to you.
Do you have an idea how many?
A handful.
A handful in just the past 6 weeks? More indictments, more guilty pleas?
I need to check on the records of that. But for example, there was someone who was arrested.
Are they in the Gutierrez case you said, or other cases?
There are other cases.
So we have Mr. Gutierrez, who's been indicted and pled guilty, and in the last 6 weeks, you've had other indictments and guilty pleas with employees in those 29 open fraud investigations.
Not with employees.
Not with employees.
Not with employees. We have cases that are at various stages.
I understand.
So there are people who have been indicted who have pled guilty recently. There are people who had previously been arrested who have pled guilty. There are people who previously pled guilty who have been sentenced.
And so these aren't employees, but there are people from the public sector or the private sector trying to get financing from the Ex-Im Bank.
That's correct.
Okay. And had they received financing? Or was it was it while they were trying to get financing?
In these particular matters, it was they had already received.
They had already
financing.
gotten taxpayer money.
Defaulted. Yep.
Okay. So now, are you familiar with the company Newsat?
Yes.
And did Ex-Im loan them some money?
Yes, they did.
Was it a direct loan?
I believe so.
Yeah. Do you know how many millions of dollars?
I believe it was north of $200 million commitment, although it hasn't been all dispersed at this point.
North of 200. And were you the largest financer of Newsat when they were seeking financing for the business?
I believe the U.S. Ex-Im Bank is the lead financer.
You were the lead financer, and isn't it true that Newsat's now went bankrupt?
That's correct.
And how much are the taxpayers on the hook for?
I believe at this point it's around $150 million, but there's potential for recoveries in that matter that could reduce that amount.
Potentially $150 million of north of $200 million that the Ex-Im loaned to this company. A review commissioned by independent Newsat directors reported, quote, appalling corporate behavior, complete lack of control at Newsat, including opulent $10,000 dinners, extensive overseas travel, millions in executive bonuses and raises, tax evasion, and $400,000 in undisclosed payments to a yacht company owned by Newsat's former CEO. Pretty bad stuff going on. How did this all fly under the bank's radar?
This transaction has been on our radar screen for some time, since last summer. We've announced that we're going to conduct an inspection of this transaction. We're currently in the process of gathering documents. We're going to be speaking with people, and I know
Since last summer, what my understanding is they were still getting money as late as last summer. So,
or I believe that there were issues that were raised by an independent auditor and the Australian securities regulators last summer, and at that point, I believe Ex-Im stopped dispersing on that commitment.
I would like to place on the record a copy of a report, which includes some limited redactions. Excuse me, back up, without objection, so entered. So you're familiar with this, Mr. McCarthy?
I'm familiar with the existence of the report. I'm not familiar with its contents.
Let me read a little bit to you. This is from Mr. Rudd himself. Again, these are part of the independent directors here at Newsat who commissioned this report. Within 2 hours of commencing, let me back up. I've been at Newsat for 6 weeks now in the report, one of the confidential documents. Documents, not confidential, it's been redacted. Within 2 hours of commencing, I realized the company had some serious performance issues and that there was a total disconnect between what the lenders were expecting in terms of financial outcomes and what was actually happening. Of course, this ultimately resulted in the earnings downgrade announcement into the market, but it has also led me to look into past activities. Much of this information was fed to independent directors. So within 2 hours, this guy comes in. This is clear back in early summer last year. Within 2 hours of being there, he says there are big problems. So what we want to know is, how in the world did the bank miss this?
As part of our inspection, we're going to be looking into the due diligence that the bank conducted or did not conduct on this transaction, but I don't have that information at this time.
So you mentioned 29 ongoing open fraud investigations. Is this one of the 29?
Right now, what we've announced is that we're going to conduct an inspection, which is different than an investigation. It's more in the nature of an audit where we go in and try to figure out what happened in the transaction. Depending on what evidence develops, it could be converted or referred into an investigation, but it's not an investigation at this time.
And what kicks it to the investigation level? I mean, if the fact that the taxpayer's on the hook for $150 million, you've got this guy figuring it out within 2 hours, you were the lead financer in this deal, what kicks it up to a real investigation?
It would be evidence of fraud or misrepresentations that were made to the Ex-Im Bank, as opposed to bad business practices.
Wow, this sure looks like fraud to me. I think it would look like fraud to the American taxpayer, and something that obviously we need to get to the bottom of. My time is over. I apologize. I will give an extra few minutes on the second. We'll do a quick second round, and then I know we all got pressing things. So, well, wait a minute. The gentleman from North Carolina is still first round. So the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized, and then we'll go to Mr. Cartwright.
I'll be very brief. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for leading the way. Mr. McCarthy, you are not new to the Inspector General's role, just new at this particular role, having dealt in a number of other areas. I guess the troubling thing is the chairman was just talking about with regards to an inspection versus an investigation. Have we not seen enough of a pattern here of perhaps corruption that we could go ahead and go to that investigative mode? Because what I've found with Inspector Generals, they do their inspection, and then there's a long period of time, and then they do the investigation after it. Why are you making that choice here?
I don't anticipate that there would be a long period of time, but what we need to do is that there are a lot of press reports on this. There's information from people in Australia, and we need to do an analysis of the documentation and speak to some people to discover, to learn more information about whether there's evidence that there are crimes committed or frauds that are committed against Ex-Im Bank. There are certainly irregularities in this transaction, but as far as our jurisdiction goes, that's what we're looking for. If we develop that evidence, we'll convert it into investigation. The issue is that I know Congress always wants a lot of information. When we're doing inspections and audits, that's one thing. If something is converted into an investigation, then information will not be as accessible.
All right, so we have a number. Mr. Heiss from Georgia mentioned a couple of issues. The chairman's mentioned a couple of issues. As we start to look at this, I mean, we're talking about real dollars, taxpayer dollars, in terms of the amount of money that has been fraudulently, in many cases, obtained or at least disposed of. How would you characterize the reforms that the Ex-Im Bank has embarked on? Because here's my concern, is we reauthorized this just a few years ago, and with that came a series of reforms to try to make sure that the accountability is not there. And now we're being asked again to reauthorize it. And would you say that there is a culture of corruption in and around much of the import-export transactions?
I wouldn't characterize it that way. As far as the internal controls and the improvements that need to be made at the bank, there have been significant improvements that have been made over the past several years. But as our reports show, and as our open recommendations show, and as our continuing fraud cases show, that there are more things that need to be done to try to detect and deter these frauds, to prevent them from happening in the first place. But I do see some progress. So one of the questions that the chairman had was, were these people caught after they stole the money or before? I mean, we do have, just last week, we got a referral from the bank on something that was stopped before it happened. And then we're looking into that now to see what further action that we might take on that. So we are seeing progress in some of these areas, but as you recognize, these are large dollar amounts, and no amount of fraud is acceptable against the United States.
So what you're saying is that you're characterizing this, that import-export is just like every other federal program? Because that's not what I'm seeing. I mean, so are you saying it's no worse than some of the other loan programs that we have?
Well, I don't have specific data that I can make those comparisons, but
Well, but around the IRS and a number of other agencies throughout your career with the federal government, so you have some institutional knowledge. So are you saying that this is better or worse?
I don't think that the problems with fraud that XM is encountering are unique to XM. I think that those problems are common. to other federal credit
I'm looking for you to give me a qualitative, not necessarily how you responded, but is it better or worse than some of the other institutions that you're familiar with or have worked with?
I think that it's on the fraud question.
Yes.
I think that it's comparable. I don't think that it's worse than other agencies. So, for example, like the SBA, they've had 30 convictions in their last 6-month period for similar types of fraud schemes.
Yeah, the difference is the dollar amount with SBA.
In some instances, but most of the frauds that we're seeing are generally in the $1 to $5 million space, which is where SBA is operating frequently as well.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized. Then we'll go to Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. McCarthy, my dear friend, Mr. Meadows, just asked you flat out whether there was a culture of corruption at the Ex-Im Bank, and that's a fair question. And you said you would not characterize it that way, didn't you?
And that's what I said. And I think that what you made reference to, what I discussed last summer, is that there are cases of serious employee misconduct that we've discovered at the bank. There are 4 employees who have committed either criminal or fireable offenses within the past few years. On the other hand, there are more than 400 employees who work at this bank. I know that the chairman of this committee and others have generally said 99% of federal employees are doing a good job, and that those numbers, those types of statistics would indicate that the Ex-Im Bank was more common in that area. I certainly don't mean to minimize the very serious issues of Mr. Gutierrez and the other employees, but we're talking about a small number of employees at this point. We are concerned.
I don't mean to cut you off, but suppose somebody just walked into this hearing room, or maybe just clicked on the television if it's on TV someplace. They might think you're kind of sticking up for the Ex-Im Bank, that you're kind of in with it. Maybe you're an employee of the Ex-Im Bank, and I think maybe one thing you and I ought to make clear to everybody is what your role is. You are the acting inspector general. Does that mean you're an employee of the Ex-Im Bank?
It means that I'm an employee of the bank, but we are independent from the bank's management.
And does that mean you need to be sticking up for the Ex-Im Bank no matter what?
The goal of my goal and the goal of my office, and I've conveyed this to everyone on our staff, is that Congress is having a policy dispute about how to handle the Ex-Im Bank. Our goal is to provide facts. So I can give you information and tell you these are the number of employees, this is what we know about the cases that we have.
Are you independent, Mr. McCarthy?
Yes, we're an independent office within the bank.
That's the point I'm trying to establish.
We have our own budget. We don't.
You're not here to stick up for the Ex-Im Bank no matter what. You're an independent voice, and that's why you're kind of the auditor, aren't you?
We have an arm's length relationship from the bank so that we can be independent in conducting audits and investigations.
So when you disagree that there was a culture of corruption at the Ex-Im Bank, you don't do so as somebody that is going to stick up for the Ex-Im Bank no matter what. You do so as an independent observer. Is that correct?
Well, I'm trying to not, rather than doing characterizations, I'm trying to present Congress with all the facts and let you make your own determinations about culture and those types of issues.
All right, now we talked about the Johnny Gutierrez case, brazen bribery scheme at the bank. At the time that you, last summer, when members of this committee asked you when you testified about the case involving Mr. Gutierrez, you indicated you could not discuss it because it was an ongoing investigation. That makes sense. Your written testimony today indicates you are now in a position to discuss the matter in light of recent proceedings concerning Mr. Gutierrez in court. According to your testimony, on April 22 this year, Mr. Gutierrez pled guilty to bribery for accepting over $78,000 in bribes from June 2006 to December 2013 in exchange for recommending the approval of loans to applicants who were basically unqualified during the course of his employment. Is that correct?
That's all correct.
All right. Now, even before Mr. Gutierrez had pleaded guilty to the bribery, can you tell us what action, if any, the bank took against Mr. Gutierrez?
So Mr. Gutierrez's involvement in this scheme was discovered in the course of a fraud investigation. When we developed the evidence that Mr. Gutierrez was involved, we developed documentary evidence, and then at one point we consulted with the bank, and our agents confronted Mr. Gutierrez and interviewed him about his involvement. At that point, he was placed on administrative leave, and termination proceedings were begun against him, and eventually he was removed from his position at the
All right,
bank
now, were any other
while the
employees-
investigation was pending.
I only have so much time. Were there any other employees implicated in the Gutierrez case?
Yes, there's another employee who's also removed from his position.
He was removed from his position. Now, beyond that one other employee, has your office uncovered any evidence that the bribery scheme involving Mr. Gutierrez and this other employee was widespread among other employees at the bank?
We have not developed evidence of that.
No evidence of other employees involved in this scheme. I'm pleased to hear it. I also want to know how the matter involving Mr. Gutierrez was first brought to the attention of the OIG. How did your office first find out about it?
We received a referral about suspicious claims activity in the transactions, and then in the course of looking into fraud in those transactions, we discovered evidence pointing us to Mr. Gutierrez.
Was it the bank's own employees that reported it to you?
Yes.
All right. So in the course of your investigation, did you uncover any evidence that anyone in the bank's senior management was involved in that misconduct?
We did not.
What about with respect to any political appointees at the Ex-Im Bank?
No.
Okay, no evidence of any involvement in that scheme.
No evidence.
All right. Well, now, in your assessment, did the Gutierrez bribery scheme go undetected for a long time due to deficiencies in the bank's internal controls at the time?
Yes. The fact that he was able to perpetrate this scheme for a period of time suggests deficiencies in internal controls.
And that's one of your jobs, to make recommendations about internal controls, right?
That's correct.
Did you make recommendations?
Following the Gutierrez scheme, we made some additional recommendations
What
about
were they?
internal controls. Well, one of the things that the bank has done in response, one of the ways that Mr. Gutierrez was able to thwart the system and to circumvent controls was that he concealed information about previous credit histories of people applying for new applications. So now the bank requires documentation of the previous experience of those companies be attached to the documents that go up to the
So that's a
decision
control
makers.
you recommended and the bank accepted, is that correct?
I don't know that we recommend that control specifically. I know that they put that control into place, and we've recommended more checks and balances generally for things like individual delegated authority program. Some of our recommendations have been that you need to have cross-checking and more than one employee looking at these transactions and doing cross-checks so that you can't have one employee exploiting the system.
All right, last question. Mr. McCarthy, as acting IG, do you continue to keep an eye on the Ex-Im Bank? Do you continue to serve as the watchdog for that organization?
That's the role of our office.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your testimony.
Yield
back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. McCarthy, I'm going to go back to a question I asked earlier. So employees and folks at Newsat smell trouble. They hire an outside consultant to come in and look at it. Within 2 hours, he says, whoa, this thing's a mess. This is Mr. Rudd. He issues this report. Have you seen the report?
I personally haven't read the report.
And is there a reason you haven't read the report?
We generally have our inspectors who are working on that project.
So has anyone at the Inspector General in your office read the report?
I don't know.
Have you asked, do you have the report in your possession?
I don't know.
Have you asked Mr. Hochberg for the report?
We've made document requests surrounding the transaction. I would assume that it was included, that
Wait, you got to tell me, exactly. Have you asked for the Rudd report or haven't you?
We've asked for a number of different documents in a number of different categories. I believe the Rudd report will be included in that standard request that we have, but I can't confirm that we've asked for that specifically.
And have they, well, okay, so you believe you've asked for it. Have they given it to you?
I don't know what the current document production status is on that at this time.
Well, it's pretty important. I mean, within 2 hours, they know there's a mess there. The Financial Services Committee gets it. We want to know if you've got it. You think well, you tell me you don't have it. You think you've asked for it. What I want to know is, why hasn't the Export-Import Bank given it to you?
We will get from the Export-Import Bank all of the documents. That's our goal. That will be one of the key documents that we'll look at, but we want to get all of the
Do you
documents that are
think,
relevant to this
Mr. McCarthy,
transaction.
do you think you have it in your possession now? You being the Inspector General's office at the Export-Import Bank, do you think you have this in your possession now?
I don't know.
You do not know.
I don't know.
And you didn't think to check on this before you came here, knowing that how important this was, how, damning this information was and this report was of what went on with the NewSat deal?
We have a number of different transactions that we're looking at any given time, and
Yeah, but you don't have anywhere you're on the hook, the taxpayers are on the hook for $150 million, right? That's pretty big. And based on what you're telling me is you believe you've asked for it, but they haven't given it to you. And I want to know why. Why won't Mr. Hochberg and the bank give you this information?
I don't know that we've received it yet.
You said when did you start your audit, which we hope gets pumped up and jumped up to an investigation? When did you start your audit of the NewSat deal?
I believe we announced the audit within the past month.
I mean, 20 days ago, 30 days ago,
I don't know. I can get you the exact date.
sometime in May?
I don't know.
And you believe you've asked for it, and they haven't given it to you.
I don't know if they've given it to us or not. I don't keep tabs on every individual
Okay, so
document that we
here's what we want you to
receive that
do.
we ask
Here's what we want you to
in real
do. We
time.
want to go back and we want you to confirm you've actually asked for it,
Yes.
and then we want you to let us know if they've given it to you,
Okay.
if they've already given it to you. If
Okay.
they haven't given it to you and they give it to you tomorrow, that doesn't count.
Okay.
Understand?
Understood.
All right. One last question. Where's Mr. McCarthy's testimony? So we have four folks who've got some problems in the Gutierrez case. In your testimony, when you're getting near the end, you mention another XM employee was separated from employment due to substantiated misconduct in this case. This is in the Gutierrez case. So what's that mean? Separated from employment due to substantiated misconduct. I mean, that sounds like government speak for this person was fired. Is that what happened?
This person no longer works for the bank.
Okay. Can you tell me something about this person? Are they going to be indicted and plead guilty, and then when we bring them here, take the fifth or other order? But is that all going to happen with this person too?
As I've indicated, this still remains an open matter. This is an open investigation. This individual is a potential witness against other subjects, and therefore I can't provide a lot of information about this employee at this time.
Have the other two, there were 4 in this case, have the other 2 been separated from employment due to substantiated misconduct? Has that happened with the other 2?
There were 4 last summer overall in separate cases. Yes, the other 2 cases which have been reported on, both of those employees have left the bank.
Okay. It's real important we get that information on the Rudd report as soon as possible. That should be easy to check, Mr. McCarthy. You should be able to get that to us, hopefully even as early as tomorrow.
I'll get back to you promptly.
I appreciate it. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCarthy, does the bank have any kind of policy regarding sending funds to countries that we here in the United States have imposed sanctions upon countries that are known to be violating human rights and other abuses?
I believe there are charter requirements that specifically limit countries that are ineligible to receive funds. And yes, the bank, as a matter of policy, consults with the State Department and has countries that it won't do business with for those reasons.
Were you aware that the bank does provide assistance to some of those countries?
Specifically?
Yeah, according to the bank's annual report of 2014, for example, the bank has hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. tax dollar exposures in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Venezuela, Iraq, $4.5 billion in China, $1.5 billion in Russia. Are you not aware of this? This is your annual report, or the bank's annual report.
I believe it's the bank's annual report.
Yeah, the bank's annual.
We've looked at some of the programs like Iran sanctions and have concluded that the bank is complying with that and haven't found any issues. As far as outstanding loans to some of these other countries, I don't know the timing of when those loans were issued. It's possible that there may have been loans issued previously that are still on the books, and subsequent to that, their aren't doing new business because of new developments. But I don't know the details.
Or do you have any idea how long the bank has had a policy not to do business with countries that we have imposed sanctions on for their human rights violations?
I don't know the specifics of each one.
Do you have any idea, say, the countries that I mentioned, Sudan, Venezuela, any of these countries, are you aware of the average labor rates, the wages in those countries?
I'm not personally familiar with all that information.
Is that something that your office monitors?
What we look at is that in some of our inspections, the bank has social and environmental policies that are conditions of the transactions. In some of our inspections, we look at compliance with those policies.
So is that a yes or no? Do you
Know whether the specifics of the wages, there are whatever the bank's social and environmental policies are. If there are policies that specifically address wages, we would look at that.
Do you think that's something that ought to be monitored?
But to the extent that it affects the charter requirements and the policies of the United States, it should be monitored.
So it should be. Is that correct? Is that what your answer is?
I'm saying
This is your opinion. Is that something that should be monitored? I mean, we're talking about countries that we have sanctions upon because they're human rights violations. And many of these countries are paying extremely low wages. That seems to me it would be a reasonable thing for us to monitor if these countries are indeed involved in human rights violations.
the bank has policies on those issues, and we monitor compliance with.
So you do monitor?
We monitor whether the bank is complying with its policies. I don't know the details on that particular policy.
All right, let's look at the Congo, for example. It's a country that is under U.S. sanctions, a country that was recently identified as the third worst human rights offender in the world. Should that country be benefiting from U.S. tax dollars?
I believe if the policy is that countries that are under sanctions, that's a determination that's made by the Exim Bank and the State Department not to do business with that country. If that determination has been made, then the Exim Bank should not be doing business with that country.
Okay, but you said there is a policy, and here we are doing business with hundreds of millions of dollars to the third worst country in the world. Why would that be? How in the world could something like that just slip through the cracks?
I don't know the timing of those transactions.
Does it matter?
Well, if there are previous commitments that have been made and long-standing and long-term commitments, and then sanctions are imposed at a later date, there's a certain amount of time that there has to be an unwinding of those transactions.
All right, well, let's go beyond. I feel like you're just beating around the bush, quite frankly, on these. We're talking about some U.S. sanctions. These are not things that are hidden in a closet somewhere. We as a country have sanctions against these countries that the Exim Bank is doing business with. And you don't know what the wages are. You don't know anything. You know, it's rather stunning to me. Are you aware that we have many deals with sub-Saharan African countries in the portfolio where there is tremendously low index, if you will, for corruption?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
You're aware of that, and you're aware of the fact that we're doing business with a lot of these countries. Is it concerning that the bank is involved in facilitating businesses and countries where there is great corruption?
When the bank is doing business in countries that have corruption problems, there need to be appropriate safeguards in place. There's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the due diligence done to ensure that that money isn't being diverted to corruption.
So you're saying that you can assure us and guarantee us that those countries that money is being loaned to through Exim Bank, where there is great corruption, you can assure us that none of that money is being involved in corruptive activity?
If the bank is sending money over there, they need to take appropriate steps to ensure compliance with the sanctions that the U.S. has in
I'm
place.
sure they need to, but can you assure us that that money is not being used for corruption?
We haven't done work specifically in that. I can say the only thing we've looked specifically at is compliance with Iran sanctions, and we found the bank was compliant with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time is up.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCarthy. Thank you for your time, your service to our country. Obviously, these are not fun times when you get to come and testify. I do appreciate, though, your expeditious way that you've agreed to supply some of those documents to the committee. That's duly noted. And if there is no further business before the committee, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.